Based on Tim Burton's 1988 iconic movie, Beetlejuice for the NES, released in 1991, is an oddball yet fascinating game that combines platforming action with quirky, offbeat humor. While not a blockbuster hit like some other titles of the NES era, the game gained a following due to its distinct style, challenging gameplay, and its connection to a beloved movie. Developed by Rare and published by LJN, Beetlejuice is an example of how movie-to-game adaptations were handled in the early days of console gaming. The development for the NES was undertaken by Rare, a British video game company that was becoming a prominent name in the gaming industry. By the early 1990s, Rare had developed a variety of titles for the NES, including Battletoads and Cobra Triangle. However, in this instance, they were tasked with turning a popular, quirky movie into a playable NES game, which was no easy feat given the movie's unconventional storyline and dark humor. LJN, the game's publisher, was known at the time for handling many licensed properties, including games based on movies like Friday the 13th, Jaws, and Back to the Future. Unfortunately, many of LJN's licensed games received mixed to poor reviews due to subpar quality, but Beetlejuice stood out slightly due to its challenging gameplay and faithful adaptation of the movie's bizarre world. Given the limitations of the NES hardware and the complexity of Tim Burton's movie, Rare had to get creative in translating Beetlejuice's gothic style and chaotic energy into an 8-bit game. The game is far from a direct retelling of the movie, instead focusing more on capturing its eccentric tone and featuring Beetlejuice himself as the central character in a platformer adventure. In Beetlejuice for the NES, you play as the infamous Ghost with the Most himself, Beetlejuice, as he attempts to rid the Maitland household of unwanted ghosts and other strange creatures. Though the game loosely follows the premise of the movie, it doesn't directly follow the movie's narrative. The game's story revolves around Beetlejuice's quest to scare the living out of the Maitland's house, which the recently deceased couple, Adam and Barbara Maitland, had inhabited. Along the way, Beetlejuice faces various enemies, traps, and puzzles. Throughout the game, the protagonist uses his unique abilities to deal with enemies and clear obstacles, all while traversing different stages set in weird, spooky environments. While not a deeply narrative game, it relies heavily on its zany atmosphere, unusual enemy designs, and a world that feels ripped right out of Tim Burton's imagination. There's also an added layer of strangeness, as Beetlejuice collects scare points throughout the levels to purchase various powers, further highlighting his mischievous, chaotic persona. The game is primarily a side-scrolling platformer with some puzzle-solving elements, which were common in NES games of the time. Here's a breakdown of some of the main gameplay features. The core of Beetlejuice's gameplay is its platforming. As Beetlejuice, players jump, duck, and dodge obstacles, all while fighting off enemies like rats, skeletons, and strange supernatural creatures. The combat is fairly simple, involving basic attacks using Beetlejuice's stomp or collecting items that let him use magic or special abilities. However, the hit detection and controls can be a bit tricky, which adds to the game's challenge. One of the unique aspects of this game is its scare point system. Throughout the game, players can collect scare points by defeating enemies or finding hidden items. These points can then be spent at specific scare shops to purchase various transformations or special abilities for Beetlejuice, such as turning into a skeleton to defeat certain enemies or using different forms to access hidden areas. The levels in Beetlejuice are diverse, each with its own distinct design and obstacles. Players will navigate through haunted houses, graveyards, and other bizarre locations, all of which are in line with the movie's gothic, otherworldly aesthetic. Each stage introduces new enemies and mechanics, keeping the gameplay fresh and unpredictable. The game makes use of environmental hazards that range from moving platforms to crumbling floors, which require precise timing and careful navigation. The difficulty can spike at times, especially with hazards that can kill Beetlejuice instantly, requiring players to memorize level layouts and enemy patterns. In addition to the platforming action, Beetlejuice includes some light puzzle solving. Players must often figure out how to unlock doors, find hidden items, or use their transformations to progress through different areas of a level. While these puzzles aren't overly complex, they add variety to the otherwise straightforward platforming gameplay. At the end of certain stages, players face off against bosses that require more than just quick reflexes to defeat. These bosses usually have specific attack patterns that players must learn, along with weak spots that must be exploited. While the bosses don't directly tie into the movie's characters, they add an extra layer of challenge to the game. Like many NES games, Beetlejuice is known for its high level of difficulty. The controls can feel a bit stiff, and some of the platforming sections are unforgiving, which means that players will need to be persistent to make it through to the end. The lack of a password or save system also means that players have to complete the game in one sitting, making it a true test of patience and skill. The game was developed by Rare, a company that would go on to develop some of the most beloved and critically acclaimed games in history, such as Donkey Kong Country, GoldenEye 07, and Banjo-Kazooie. Despite the limitations of working on a licensed game for LJN, Rare's involvement ensured that Beetlejuice was at least technically sound, with solid level design and clever use of the NES's capabilities. While the game borrows heavily from the style and humor of the Beetlejuice movie, it doesn't strictly follow the movie's plot. Instead, it acts as a sort of spin-off adventure for Beetlejuice, placing him in a series of new scenarios with different enemies and challenges. This gave the developers more freedom to create levels and mechanics that fit the gameplay, rather than strictly adhering to the movie's story. The inclusion of the scare points system is one of the more unique features of this game. By collecting scare points, players could unlock new powers and transformations, making it one of the early examples of a currency-based upgrade system in a platformer. These transformations allowed players to experience the game in different ways, as each form had its own strengths and weaknesses. The game successfully captures Tim Burton's signature visual style, with eerie backdrops, grotesque enemy designs, and a dark, quirky atmosphere. For fans of the movie, this attention to detail helped make the game feel like an extension of the Beetlejuice universe, even if it didn't directly tie into the movie's storyline. The game's soundtrack, while not composed by Danny Elfman, who did the music for the Beetlejuice movie, still tries to capture the same spooky, whimsical tone. The music and sound effects are fairly standard for NES games, but contribute to the overall eerie and chaotic atmosphere that defines the game. Like many LJN-published games, Beetlejuice is notorious for its difficulty. The game doesn't offer much in terms of hand-holding, and the lack of continues or a save system means that players have to master each level if they hope to reach the end. This difficulty, combined with some clunky controls, can be frustrating, but it also adds to the game's cult status among retro gamers. While Beetlejuice the NES game is based more on the movie than the animated series, some elements of the game, particularly Beetlejuice's exaggerated antics, feel closer in tone to the 1989 to 1991 animated Beetlejuice TV show, which was popular around the time of the game's release. Beetlejuice for the NES may not have been the most groundbreaking game of its time, but it certainly captured the quirky, chaotic spirit of the movie. With its challenging platforming gameplay, unique scare point system, and distinct visual style, the game became a cult favorite for fans of the movie and retro gaming enthusiasts alike. Although the game can be frustrating due to its difficulty and control issues, its connection to one of the most iconic movies of the 1980s and its strange yet captivating design make it a memorable part of the NES library. For players looking to relive the weird, spooky fun of Beetlejuice, or for those simply looking for a tough, old-school platformer, Beetlejuice for the NES offers a unique, if not always easy, gaming experience.